5 AP Macroeconomics Review. So this is the foreign unit, and there's several things we covered in the foreign unit, but I wanted to start with trade. Now remember, in economics, on the base level, trade is always beneficial. We want a balance of exports and imports because exports help producers, imports help consumers. So trade on both sides ends up helping one of the groups of a circular flow. And trade increases productivity because if we specialize by focusing on one thing, we can become more productive on that one thing, which leads to larger GDP growth for the entire world and leads to long-run growth. So with that, when we're measuring trade, there's two ways we could measure it: absolute and comparative advantage. But before we can tell who has the absolute and comparative advantage, we need to look at two types of trade problems: input problems and output problems. Telling the difference between these two types of problems can get every question right on a comparative advantage question or every question wrong. So an input problem is when there's changing resources but a fixed output. So down here, I have Miss Frank and Mrs. Moore making pies and cakes in the time it takes them to make one pie and one cake. So what's changing is time, the resource. What's fixed is the one pie and one cake that they can make. Perfect example of an input problem. And the most common AP resource that we see is time. The other ones I've seen, though, are acres of land and labor units. You see those changing. It is an input problem. An output problem is when it's changing quantity with a fixed resource. So on the top problem, this is the number of pies and cakes that we could make given in an hour. So because of that, it's changing quantity, the number we can make, and what is fixed is the time, the resource. So now that you know that, the first thing we're going to look at is absolute advantage, which really is just who's better at making pies and cakes. In an output problem, the larger number has the absolute advantage. She can make more pies than I can in an hour, and she can make more cakes than I can in an hour. But that doesn't mean she shouldn't trade with me. We don't base trade on absolute advantage, because if we did that, most countries wouldn't trade with one another. They would just try and focus on everything they're better at themselves. Instead, we base trade on comparative advantage, by how much we're giving up instead of just who's better. So the absolute advantage in an input problem is the lower number because it says who uses the least amount of resources to make one of that product. So now, because it's time on the bottom problem, I would have the absolute advantage in the production of pies and cakes because it takes me less time to make a pie and a cake than Mrs. Moore. So absolute advantage is the larger number in an output problem and the smaller number in an input problem. So now we're going to do comparative advantage. Comparative advantage measures opportunity cost. And to calculate the opportunity cost for Mrs. Moore and I have a simple system to set up the equation. So for me to make one pie, I divide in an output problem the outside number by the inside number to get the opportunity cost. So I would give up 2 cakes in order to make one pie. That's my opportunity cost. And then I would just switch it around. For me to make one cake, I would give up 10 over 20, 1/2 of a pie. Then I'm going to do the same exact thing for Mrs. Moore. For Mrs. Moore to make one pie, she gives up the outside number over the inside number, 4/3 of a cake. For Mrs. Moore to make one cake, she gives up, flip it around, 3/4 of a pie. So now what I'm looking at in blue is the opportunity cost, and that is what I use to determine trade for pies and cakes by who's giving up a lower amount. So for pies, because 4/3 is less than 2, Mrs. Moore has the comparative advantage in the production of pies. She gives up less than I do to make pies. And for cakes, because 1/2 is less than 3/4, I have the comparative advantage. I give up less to make cakes. So that is how we determine who should specialize and who should export a good, and also who should import a good. So for example, I will specialize and export cakes, and I will import in pies, the thing I do not have the comparative advantage of. The last thing we need to do with this is terms of trade. So if they change the ratio, the buying and selling price of a pie or a cake, would Mrs. Moore and I still be willing to trade with one another? So I do this by setting up a ratio for both goods and seeing does it fit into the ratio. So for pies, Mrs. Moore and I will still be willing to trade as long as the number is between the two opportunity costs, between 4/3 or 2. And this is because, as the seller of pies, this is Mrs. Moore's minimum price she is willing to sell a pie for. If it's her cost of producing it, any price lower than 4/3, she would be losing money and she'd be selling it for less than her cost of production, which wouldn't be in her benefit. Any price higher, she's making a profit and she's perfectly happy to trade. The 2 represents my own opportunity cost if I were to make pies myself. So if the number was greater than 2, I'm not willing to buy it from Mrs. Moore because it would be cheaper as the buyer for me to just make it myself. So the buyer, the higher opportunity cost, wants the lowest number possible because that means they're not paying as much for the good. The seller, the lower number, wants the highest price possible because that's the higher the price, the more profit they make. Then I'm going to do the same thing for cakes. But now the difference is I am the seller. So 1/2 is my minimum price I'm willing to sell cakes for. Otherwise, I'd be losing money. Any price higher than 1/2, I am perfectly willing to sell it. Then Mrs. Moore is now the buyer, and 3/4 is the max price she's willing to pay for a cake. If it's a price higher than 3/4, it'd be cheaper for her to just make it herself. So that's how we determine terms of trade. And in an input problem, it's very similar, with 2 significant differences, and I've already gone over one of them. Absolute advantage is different in an input problem because now the lower number is the person who's better at making it originally. And then what we're going to do is turn this input problem into an output problem so we can analyze it the same exact way we did the output problem. And all I have to do to turn it into an output problem is divide it in the opposite way, which sounds complicated, but then if you remember the trick, it keeps it pretty simple. In an input problem, you divide the inside number by the outside number. What I mean by this, for me to make one pie, I divide 10/20 to get the opportunity cost. I would give up 1/2 of a cake. For me to make a cake, I just flip it around again, I would give up 2 pies. Same thing for Mrs. Moore. For her to make one pie, she gives up 30/40, 3/4 of a cake. For her to make one cake, she gives up, flip it around, 4/3 of a pie. So by switching the math from here on out, we analyze it the exact same way we analyze the output problem. We look at who has the lower opportunity cost to make pies, which I do because 1/2 is less than 3/4. And then Mrs. Moore has the lower opportunity cost in making cakes because 4/3 is less than 2. So I will sell and export pies and import cakes. Mrs. Moore will sell cakes, specialize in cakes, and import in pies. And the terms of trade is the exact same as well. So for pies, Mrs. Moore and I will still trade as long as the terms of trade are between 1/2 and 3/4. But now, since I am the seller of pies, the 1/2 is my minimum price I am willing to sell pies for. Any price higher, I'm making a profit, I'm happy, but any price lower, I'd be losing money. And the 3/4 is Mrs. Moore's maximum price she's willing to pay for pies, because any price higher than 3/4, it'd be cheaper for her to just make it herself. And the same exact idea for cakes. But now Mrs. Moore is the exporter, so the 4/3 is her minimum price she's willing to sell it for, and the 2 is the importer's maximum price I'm willing to pay for cakes. And that's all you have to do for comparative advantage. In the foreign market, we look at what's known as a balance of payments. And this is not exclusive to GDP. So things that counted and didn't count in GDP may or may not count in balance of payments. What determines if it counts in America's balance of payments is if other countries are putting their money into America, or if America is spending more money in other countries. So it looks at transactions between countries. And those types of transactions is what I'm going to talk about first. The types of transactions that we look at are defined by 2 accounts, the current and the capital account. Current account looks at immediate transactions in other countries. So for example, I am buying a good and receiving a good from another country. So exports and imports would count under current account, which includes some physical capital. For example, if I bought a robot from China, China ships me that robot and the money comes back to America. It's an immediate transaction. So investment in GDP doesn't necessarily mean investment in the foreign market. Also under the current account, tourism, because you're immediately spending money in another country, and foreign aid, because you are immediately giving money to another country, and payments on existing investments. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. The other account is the capital account. The capital account looks at direct investments in other countries. And what's different from GDP is this includes money investments in other countries, like stocks and bonds and investments that don't count in investment in GDP because they're purely financial. So the other thing with the balance of payments we have to decide is if it's an asset or a liability for a country. Assets is when it's bringing money into a country. So for example, exports bring money into our economy, would be an asset. Or when tourism occurs in the United States, that would be an asset for the United States. Or if other countries are investing in America, that would be an asset for America. Liabilities is when our money is leaving America and being put into other countries. So imports, we're putting our money into another country, it's a liability for us. Or if we are investing more in other countries, it's taking our money and putting it into the other country. With that, it determines whether or not we have a current account surplus or deficit. If we have more assets than liabilities in the current account, then we have a current account surplus. Opposite, if we have more liabilities than assets, we have a current account deficit. Same thing for the capital account. More assets leads to a surplus, more liabilities leads to a deficit, which we need to look at that a little bit more because this is called balance of payments. So by definition, the current account and the capital account have to balance one another out. What I mean by that is if there is a deficit in one account, there has to be a surplus in the other, or vice versa. So how this works is kind of interesting. If the United States, and I just have an example with the United States and China, where the US is importing in more goods from China, that is a liability for the United States, which would create a current account deficit. For China, if we are importing more from them, that means they're exporting more, which is an asset for China, which would create a current account surplus for China. So how this works is if China has a surplus, then they have more money to invest in the capital account. So they're going to use that money to invest in the capital account and invest their money into the United States, which means in the capital account they have more liabilities and a capital account deficit. Then we switch it over to the US. If China is investing more money in the US, that is an asset for the United States, which creates a capital account surplus. So this process makes it to where naturally, most of the time, current and capital accounts balance each other out. One is in surplus and one is in a deficit. If not, then a country will have to borrow money from the IMF or from official reserves because they have to, by definition, balance each other out. So now we know the basics of foreign market. We need to look at how these assets and liabilities end up affecting the value of a currency. Most currencies float on a supply and demand currency market that I have illustrated here. So what determines the value of a currency is whether or not equilibrium price of the currency is going up or down. Free market economies let that value determine the value of their currency. Some countries like China fix their currency, so they don't allow it to float, but on AP questions, we're keeping the currencies floating so we can follow these rules of supply and demand. So how it works for a country. If, for example, this is the dollar market graph, if America is spending more money in another country, the supply of the dollar would increase. Because the supply of the dollar is affected by how much of the dollar is out there in the world. So the more we're spending in another country, the more of the dollar there is out there in the world. Demand for the dollar is determined by how much other countries are spending in America. So if other countries are spending more in America, that increases the demand for the dollar. Or if they're spending less money in America, it's decreasing the demand for the dollar. So by putting their currency into America, it's increasing the demand for our dollar. Then whatever happens to supply and demand changes equilibrium. And that change in equilibrium price determines if a currency is stronger or appreciated or weaker, depreciated. And we notice the label on the Y. I have it compared to the euro. So for the dollar graph, it's how many euros does it take for $1. So the dollar is on the denominator on the dollar market graph. Then I have it set up compared to the euro market graph, which is the same exact idea, but for the euro instead of the dollar. So for supply of the euro, how much is Europe spending in other countries? Demand for the euro is how much are other countries spending in Europe. So let's have a scenario where Europeans decide that Harry Potter World in Orlando, Florida is an ideal tourist destination. So what I do in all of these currency questions is ask the question of who's spending money in another country, because that tells you whose supply line will move. So in this case, if Europeans are touring America, Europeans are spending more money in America. So on their graph, the supply of the euro will increase, which we notice drives down the equilibrium price of the euro because more of the euro is out there in the world, and that in turn depreciates the value of the euro. On the American side, if they are putting their money into America, this would increase the demand for the dollar, which now equilibrium price is driven up, so the increased demand for the dollar will appreciate the value of the dollar. The final thing we do with these currency graphs is look at how it ends up affecting exports. And we use the value of the currency to determine how exports will change over time. It's a progression. So the change in demand leads to a change in the currency, which leads to a change in exports over time. So if the dollar has appreciated, this means with a stronger currency, our goods now look more expensive to other countries, which will hurt our exports over time. But for Europe, because their currency is depreciated, their goods now look cheaper to other countries, so their exports will then increase over time. It always follows these steps. The supply of one graph moves, the demand for the other graph moves. They always move in the same direction. You use equilibrium price to determine the value of a currency, and then you use the value of the currency to determine what happens to exports. But let's take it a little bit deeper. The last topic in the foreign exchange market is looking at foreign exchange from the perspective of the lender. Now this is an important idea because up until this point, we've looked at investment in terms of GDP. And in GDP, you are thinking, do I want to buy a house? Do I want to build a factory? Do I want to stock up on inventory? Which is all from the perspective of the borrower. And as the borrower, you desire low interest rates that encourages gross private investment in GDP. But as the lender, in the capital account, I'm thinking, do I want to invest in another country? Do I want to buy a stock from another country? Do I want to directly invest in the other country? This is from the perspective of the lender. I'm thinking, do I want to lend money to another country? Which flips the interest rate perspective. As the lender, if interest rates are high, that will encourage me to invest in another country. So if in Europe interest rates are higher than America, Americans will invest in Europe. So always keep in mind the foreign markets from the perspective of the lender. Now, where this comes into play a lot is this criticism that goes hand in hand with crowding out of gross private investment. But now, criticism of expansionary fiscal policy that says how fiscal policy hurts the XN component of GDP, so crowding out of net exports. So just like before, as expansionary fiscal policy, the government spends more and collects less in taxes, which creates a government budget deficit. And that deficit is what segues to the loanable funds market graph. So again, knowing deficit for expansionary fiscal policy is very important. Because of the deficit, the government has to borrow more or save less, which I did save less this time to show you that it could be either or, because either way, real interest rates are driven up. But what's different now is in the foreign market, the higher interest rates will actually encourage foreign investment in America. Versus in gross private investment, it discouraged investment in GDP. So it flips the perspective because we're in the foreign market. So if other countries see now that America has higher interest rates, they are going to be encouraged to invest in America, aka spend their money in America. And if they're putting their money into America, the demand for the dollar will increase. And if the demand for the dollar increases, the value of the dollar will appreciate. And the problem with that is if the value appreciates, then our goods start to look more expensive to other countries and our exports will go down over time. So this is a long process, but remember, we're in a recession. We're trying to grow GDP out of a recession, yet because other countries are investing in our higher interest rates, it ends up hurting the XN of GDP. And two reasons we still do expansionary fiscal policy even though both crowding outs occur. If the C and the G go up by a lot and the I and the XN go down by a little, overall GDP is still going up. And because, never forget, the Federal Reserve manipulates interest rates with expansionary monetary policy, which increases the money supply and drives interest rates down, counteracting both crowding out of gross private investment and crowding out of net exports. And the opposite is true as well. We had crowding in for gross private investment, we have crowding in for net exports, but it's a criticism of a contractionary fiscal policy. So now, by taxing more and spending less, the government now has a budget surplus. Again, the key word to segue into this. So now they have more money to save, which is why I have the supply of loanable funds increasing, or it could be demand for loanable funds decreasing as they borrow less. Either way, real interest rates are driven down. Why this is a problem in the foreign market is because this will end up discouraging foreign investments. Other countries don't want to invest in America because they're not going to make as much profit by lending them money, which means they are not spending money in America. So the demand for the dollar will fall, which depreciates the value of the dollar. And if the value of the dollar depreciates, this will drive exports up over time. Contractionary fiscal policy is supposed to fight inflation. Why is the XN going up when we're trying to shrink the economy out of inflation? Still, the Fed can counteract this by using contractionary monetary policy at the same time the government uses contractionary fiscal, because they focus specifically on interest rates, and that will end up driving interest rates up and counteracting this problem. And that is the end of the Unit 5 AP Macroeconomics review.